Welcome to our podcast called Collective Impact with your hosts, me, Marjella Lecourt-Alma.
And me, Nick Geurds.
Each episode features leaders at the forefront of business, sharing how they align their teams, build integrated strategies, and drive results that matter. Tune in for candid conversations and practical lessons from the voices shaping the future of business.
The level of changes and disruptions are completely interconnected.
There's always been technology, there's always been disruption, there's always been substitution. What's really changed is the speed of it.
Take others on the journey and make them see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's a path for them to go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. So today I'm here with my fellow podcast host, Nick Geurds, Chief Revenue Officer at Datamaran. And I'm very pleased to be able to announce that we have some very special guests today at our podcast. Hanne Jesca Bax, who's from EY, and Michael Sheren, who's currently involved with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. But I've known them both for many years while I was working at Datamaran, and we've seen each other, I think, on various occasions around the world. These are two leaders that, on the one hand, help businesses prepare to be as future-proof as possible, but also help global markets prepare to be as best as possible prepared for the future. We haven't seen each other in a while, so it'd be great to catch up today on, let's call this world the world of the perhaps never normal and all the change that is hitting business in terms of geopolitics, AI, and other global issues. So that's something that we will be discussing today, but perhaps a little bit more in detail about Hanne Jesca. Hanne Jesca is the EY Global Vice Chair for Clients and Industries, where she ensures that EY teams stay closely aligned to clients' critical needs. She focuses on building forward-thinking relationships with C-suite leaders, driving solutions, innovation, and improving client experience at scale. She's also a member of the EY Global Executive Committee. Hanne Jesca is passionate about creating an inclusive environment where diverse voices are heard and valued, fostering innovation and growth. Thank you so much, Hanne Jesca, for being here with us today. Would you like to add something to your introduction?
No, I think you said it well. I think the innovation and making sure we focus on the most important things, while there's so much noise around, is probably the most important thing for all of us, which is never easy.
Thank you. Then with that, over to Nick.
Thank you, Marjella. Then it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Sheren here. Michael is a global leader in green finance, governance, and sustainable policy. He's a senior advisor to the Bank of England and former co-chair to the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. He's also an active investor and a board director in green and clean technology companies. And he also has an extensive experience as a non-executive director and senior advisor across sectors and jurisdictions. He brings 25 years of global investment banking experience in New York and London. And I believe he's currently traveling quite a bit for some of his new ventures. So, Michael, pleasure to have you here. Would you like to add anything to your introduction?
Thank you, Nick. I think there's about 14 hours in the air separating us right now. It's going on the evening in Asia, but really, really pleased to be here. A great group of people. And I think, one of the areas that I've had a little bit of experience in is around leadership and also looking at where policy leaders, business leaders, and academics, and despite all the noise, despite all the turbulence, how you can cut through that and still meet objectives, important objectives for both the economic growth as well as for a climate, hitting climate initiatives.
Michael and Hanne Jesca, I think one of the stats I always find fascinating is the S&P 500 stat around declining lifespan of businesses. So in the 60s, the average lifespan of a company was 61 years. I think at current, the latest predictions are any company that is quoted as being successful is around 15 to 20 years. You both are active, I would say, in the space of creating long-term value for business. Hanne Jesca, you on the client side. Michael, you in terms of capital markets and how the money flows. What would you say in terms of your work in the past 3 to 6 months? What is on people's minds? How do people ensure business success in the long term? What can they do?
Yeah, I'll happily start. I think and I think we both kind of referenced to some of those words. I think it's those that really focus on their purpose and their longer term vision, which is really difficult, right? Because you cannot plan that far out. But I spoke to an amazing client last week, and they really brought down their strategy to five key things. And really, he said it's the same as the marathon and the sprint. He said, we are in here for the marathon, which is our five really, really focused targets. Clearly, we have to adjust, which is when we do a small sprint, but we never go too far with our sprint, so we lose the focus on the marathon. And I really like that, Marjella, because I think that the risk for everybody is you just get too distracted by everything that happens on a daily basis, everything that happens when you wake up and read the news in the morning. So I think that kind of staying the course and being very articulate about not 28 things, five things that you have to achieve or your longer term purpose. I think that's what makes the difference here.
And maybe to dig a little bit deeper on that, Hanne Jesca, what about overwhelm, right? Because it looks like everything is changing very fast at the same time. And I think there's especially also what we're seeing with AI disruption and the impact of AI on the future of work, or it's not even the future of work, it's the today of work, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel like leaders are experiencing more overwhelm than before? What is different now than perhaps previous cycles?
Yeah, clearly I'm not saying it's that easy, right? I'm just saying those that constantly focus on the news today, you just get stuck in trying to respond to the news today, Marjella, which is why I said, like, I think you gotta keep yourself grounded a little bit further out and see where you really want to get to. I think what makes it difficult is that the changes you say it's constant, as well as the level of changes and disruptions are completely, I always call them interconnected. I think they're much more interconnected than they were before, which is partly the difficulty. Like the pace of change through AI, but then if you look at the geopolitical landscape, AI and geopolitics is completely linked to it, as well as AI and sustainability are completely linked. Because I think AI causes part of the issues, but it also is one of the things that I think helps some of the sustainability issues at the same time. So I think that interconnectedness is like the Rubik's Cube. As soon as you think you got one side done, the second one starts to move in the wrong way. But therefore, a clear head, the ability to change, but kind of stay away from the panic, quick reaction, and finding, as we were chatting, finding the space for leaders to clear your head and really, yeah, not get too disrupted in your own brain, I think is really important.
And for you, Michael, I think when we think about global capital markets, there's oftentimes the language of the winners and the losers, right? So who can be winning now? What kind of cool head do you need in order to win? And what does that look like? What's the advice you would give in these times of extreme disruption and the changes in AI as well?
Well, I think as much as everything changes, everything in some ways remains the same. And what I mean by that is there's always been technology, there's always been disruption, there's always been substitution. What's really changed is the speed of it. And so there's always been substitution, everything from the horse and buggy. I've got this great, photograph that I show in Fifth Avenue. I think it's 1903. It's all horse and buggies. And in 1913, there's only one horse and buggy and they're all small automobiles. So change, even quick change is normal, but this is absolutely every morning you're waking up. This is rapid fire. And so if you're looking to how do you finance things, I do say, look, banks are in the risk adjusted reward business. So are private credit. Any investor is. So if you're in that side, you can basically go for the really risky stuff, have potentially high reward, but really be blown up in this new society. Or you can go for more what I would consider really important, dynamic, and still changing sectors. Do you have reliable cash flow that'll last over the course of the financing that'll pay its debt back? So I would say sectors like energy, mobility, real estate, agriculture, they're still being highly disrupted. I'm not saying that they're perfectly safe, but people need places to live. They need to be able to get around. They need energy to power things, and they need in those areas the companies that are providing the best products at the best prices, the good margins, and they can pay back the debt. But when I worked at GE Capital, and it feels like it was another. I wouldn't say even a century ago. It seems like millennia. I mean, Jack Welch was the CEO the whole time I was there. He was viewed as this swashbuckling leader that, knew how to, really move big corporations, and he did. But my goodness. And by the way, speaking of, GE is the only stock left on the original Dow Jones Industrials. All the rest are gone. So and even it got broken up because basically technology and other things affected it. So I guess going back to where you sit on the risk adjusted reward basis and where where you sit on that is absolutely going to be key. And what your tolerance is for your risk tolerance on this is absolutely essential.
And if I can build a little bit on that, Michael, and also Hanne Jesca, I mean, the speed of change is accelerating. I think you talked about GE under Jack Welch, that was 20 years of relatively stable performance and stable change. Within the new technological landscape and in the new diverse landscape, we see that change is happening overnight. To your point of, is a large AI company starting to maybe disrupt your industry overnight? Do you also see that this is changing the way that decisions get made and the speed at which decisions get made and validated?
Absolutely. And I think really it's putting leaders, they have to really adapt quickly. You can't be a 50, 60-year-old man or woman who's a leader who hasn't been staying on top of these things. It hasn't been literally talking, and that's the great thing about a good board. Basically, you bring in people who have expertise. I'm on the board of a small tech company, and I said, you need someone who's not just a tech person, it's a software company. You need someone who's really cutting edge. And I actually suggested to them that they almost do, it wouldn't be a hackathon, but see if under the current models, can one or two, three people do everything their company does with AI and two or three people and basically makes all their employees almost effectively redundant. And you need to know that. And if you're not paying attention to this, and if you're not working on this, there's just simply, there's no grace period. There's no transition period. You really have to move quickly.
Yeah, and I'd probably say it's the trial and error, right? I think if you don't have the luxury of time. I think you said that really well. And therefore, is it taking more risk, or is the risk actually bigger by not taking any risk, right? Sitting still, I think, is definitely not an option. And if I refer back to the marathon and sprint analogy, I think there's certain things that you cannot jeopardize to go wrong, but there's lots of other things that you actually should be able to focus on. And therefore, I think not doing anything is probably the biggest challenge. And I think that's what people are starting with. Yes, they've invested in AI, but I'm not sure they've all realized what they can do with it or what it will do to them. And I think that focus back on your core strategy, what you want to achieve, where your values are, what your customer promises, and actually get that focus out there is, I think, what separates those that are more successful than others. Focus on the outside rather than your inside operational piece.
I think at the time of the global pandemic, we saw that a lot of companies were struggling with governance and ownership. Like, who's actually in charge, right? And who saw this coming? Do you believe, Hanne Jesca, that the pandemic and other crises that followed actually created better circumstances within businesses to be prepared for these new risks and opportunities? Or would you say there's still a lot of struggle in terms of taking action and understanding who's in charge and who has the knowledge when these new risks and opportunities come up?
I think most people have learned a lot from the pandemic, Marjella. I think it showed 85% of companies were not prepared for any level of big crises. It still is it's a high percentage. It's come down a little bit, but I think leaders, therefore, are maybe more in tune of being on the forefront and knowing that they have to make a decision. I think during COVID, people were postponing things. I think CEOs realized very, very clearly that they cannot postpone things. They got to clearly make their decisions. And I think I go back to the private capital piece that Michael talked about. I think that's a skill that large corporates should definitely learn from entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs have much more, and you're one yourself, have much more of this passion and constant drive, as well as knowing that you probably have to fall down multiple times before you get it right. And I think that muscle memory is, in my view, what makes the difference. Being able to just make a decision. It's better to make a decision and maybe not make the right decision and course correct than wait for somebody else to come and help you with it.
Yeah, there's just simply not the time. I mean, if you sit still, proverbially you're just going to get eaten alive. I mean, even in, I mentioned some of the more quote unquote stable industries and sectors, energy, real estate, these kind of big physical stuff. Even that, you cannot sit still. I mean, I'm looking at one little green hydrogen company where they have some really proprietary technology, but even within that, there's AI, there's sensors that are in it they're using AI that can adjust to it. So you can't even come up with a nice technologically, really clever way of separating the hydrogen and the oxygen from the molecules in the water. You also need to basically adjust within that system, because if you're getting your energy to separate, to break the molecules from either wind or solar, it's not perfectly constant. So you need basically sensors that can adjust on that really, really well to optimize the percentage of green hydrogen purity that comes out of it. So it's in everything. So even the more stable ones, you just can't say, well, that's a really good, clever way of breaking the molecules and separating them. But no, how can I use AI to do it better? How can I do it to have the outcomes superior? If you sit still and just say, I have a really good mousetrap, your mousetrap pretty much becomes obsolete really quickly.
Yeah, and I think the other point I'd add on that, I think AI, if you only look at it for taking your operational efficiencies, that was nice when it was just coming out. I think those that really put it back at the core of their value proposition is where you really get it to scale for you. It's not a cost play; it should be a value play. I fully agree with Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And I still think we're just in the foothills. I mean, I would argue that the LLMs and the AI companies, all they are tools, enablers. And what's going to be really interesting at warp speed is over the next 2, 5, 10 years, when that AI, that improved AI, gets embedded into the real economy, into all the sectors, because we're just in the foothills now. We're just, getting, and again, every 3 months they update, but we're still just in the beginning. And the real exciting bit, and also the real terrifying bit, is when it gets embedded thoroughly. I mean, you can see really great opportunities in medicine, healthcare. You can see children having individualized education, but you can also see all the very scary things as well. So I think we're learning to adjust, and that muscle memory you talked about needs to be accelerated muscle memory. So you're falling down faster, you're getting up faster, and you're responding faster. And we've only just begun.
Thinking about the level of disruption and opportunity that AI can bring, of course, there's risks also related to the environmental impact of it. Many people are worried about that. Curious how you think we're going to solve this over time, but also in terms of the workforce and the skills we need. And what do we need in our teams? Or is it just going to be mostly agents? How do we deal with those environmental and human impacts that are also clearly part of this, a major part of this? How what will happen?
I'll take the sustainability climate bit first. So I think that's going to be really interesting. You're seeing huge amounts of energy being developed for data centers. Right now, I'm in Singapore. 20% of their power goes for data centers. Ireland had a similar situation, had to put a moratorium on it because if they didn't do that, so everyone is trying to develop energy to support these, and there's huge amounts of capex going on as well. How this works out, I mean, one of the interesting things about DeepSeek was when it came out, it used not as many of the big chips that use a lot of power, but just better engineering. So we could very easily find out, again, we don't know yet, in the next year or two, that better engineering, more efficient chips may bring down the demand. But what is encouraging for power, but what is encouraging is even in the US, large amounts of solar and wind. If you can go down to the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, there are data centers that are 100% run on renewable energy off of wind and solar. And as we were talking before the podcast came, I can give you a new gigawatt of power anywhere in the world, green, sustainable, cheaper than a new gigawatt brown. So the economics are the game. I don't care what you believe or not believe in, but if you're in business, you go for what can give you the best bang for your buck. And it's without a doubt sustainable energy. So from that point, I see the transition. This is one of the good news stories. Even with all the noise in the US, I think I was reading Bloomberg yesterday, and they were saying that 90% of the new energy coming on in the US last year, 90% was green and sustainable. Globally, it's roughly 93, 94. So there's been some real hits to offshore wind in the US, but the good news is the path of travel and what's being driven by both economics, energy security. Nobody wants to buy energy from risky places. And then also it brings down the cost of living. So for that, I think there's a really good climate sustainability story driven by economics, driven by security, driven by costs. So on the employee side, I'll hand off to someone else on that one because I think that's going to be really tricky. But the one thing I can say is when I was in Asia last, which was only about 3-4 weeks ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and I was sitting down with a colleague and OpenClaw had just come out, which is one of those agents you referred to. And everyone in Asia here is using OpenClaw and derivatives thereof. So they're taking off like bats out of hell.
Yeah, maybe a few observations. So the question always is like people are not using AI probably as smartly as they could, which means there's a lot of misuse. We've seen all the discussion spark about the tokens that not everybody was focused on. And so we spend a lot of time. We have a large workforce, which I guess is why Michael referred that question to me. So we have 400,000 women and men across the globe, across 160 countries. Our average age, which people never realize, is 29. So AI has really been adopted very, very fast. It's one of the few things that normally when something happens and we try to deploy changes in the organization, it doesn't always go as fast, but this one has gone incredibly fast. We've developed our own LLM very early on in the days, which got 95% adoption rate without bias because of that average age and the demographics of where our people are. Clearly, we still use that for a lot of the client confidential information next to a lot of the external tools that are out there. At the moment, we have seen a complete change in how our people work and really beginning to see their own AI to help them be much more efficient, but also do very different things in their job. Back to your question, Michael, we have at the moment, well, it's probably more today than it was last week. We have roughly 65,000 agents already in our workforce. But they're not, that was the question we had last week at our analyst summit. Does everybody have their own agent? No, because an agent isn't a copy of the individual. An agent focuses on a very specific piece of a process. So it would be silly that everybody have their own. It basically goes into all of the detailed processes. So I think the way of working is vastly different. Do I know exactly how it's going to be 2 years down the road? No, of course I do not. But at the moment, we see a huge spark of actual innovation around what the agent can do versus what the human can do. And so how do we have the two of them basically working together and amplifying the value that they can create?
And building a bit on that, Hanne Jesca, workforce is also for a great part leadership. How do you see the role of leadership evolving as the workforce gets more augmented with agents? And is that creating different dependencies, different styles of leaders? What's the organizational impact of that?
Well, we can probably spend a few hours around leadership. So it's a very good question. I always like to have some simple metaphors. And I probably go back to the freeze, fight, flight adage, and I've added my own F, which is flourish. I think you have to be able to deal with ambiguity, clearly, as we've already unpacked. But I think what leaders therefore need to do, I like change. I love change. Let me put it even more stronger. And so I feel like there is so much opportunity. I see it every single day, which makes it sometimes a little bit difficult for the people that work with me and my team. But a lot of people are daunted by change, where they go, they either freeze, right? And we already unpacked, there is no time to freeze, or they flight, they run away. And so I think the job of leadership is actually to create a path and take others on the journey and make them see that there is an objective, right? There's light at the end of the tunnel. There's a path for them to go. And that, I think, is a very different part of leadership. I think leaders probably think, or people think, that you always have to know the answer. I think now you have to know to ask the right questions, which is a very different way. And then my last one is we are probably all brought up to think in a linear way, and kind of not thinking in a linear way is I think what holds a lot of us back, right? It's that art of visualization to make sure you come to a better path. Fascinating. I find it fascinating.
I think that's a really, really good point. I think one of the nice things about being in the climate space is so much of the potential risks and actually some of the opportunities are non-linear. So consequently, being able to think outside of the box, being able to, try and imagine where things could go is a leadership role, and having the blue sky discussions and having all kinds of additional types of, experts and boards. I think the configurations of them are going to be very different. Some bits are going to have to be key still. How do you, even things like governance, how do you think about it when all of a sudden you've got a large amount of agents and and they're controlling data, both very private data, consumer data, customer data. But as Hanne Jesca said, you need to basically be thinking in very nonlinear ways in a very fast moving and changing market.
And in terms of your future workforce then, or our collective future workforce, what would you advise students? Where to focus on? How to best be prepared? What are you still looking for when you think about making new hires, especially junior hires?
I have one word, if I may, because I did a bunch of panels about the job apocalypse, which I think is where you're going, Marjella. And people went from, is it a skill set? Is it, it's an experience to a skill set. And I even challenged the skill set because you can teach skills and you can learn them. I think for me, it comes back to having the mindset, and I probably even higher for attitude. And is that easy for the students? Again, I think if you're daunted by it, you have to kind of rid yourself of some of that fear, because I think fear can be overpowering. I'm not saying it's easy, right? But I do think the attitude of the can-do mentality is, I think, what makes people stand out.
I think the other thing is, and they don't teach this per se, but just being authentically human, being able to communicate. Because if you're trying to teach a kid STEM now, most of the LLMs can do most STEM crunching or coding and the things that we valued very highly, even probably 5-10 years ago. But the one thing that an LLM isn't is uniquely human. That is being able to look people in the eye and be able to speak to them, be able to persuade them, to be able to write great, the LLMs can maybe correct some of your grammar, but being able to how to, put an argument, be persuasive. I love the point, Hanne Jesca, about being, positive attitude and flexible and being able to take that attitude in. But I think just having the human skills are going to be absolutely essential, because some of the skills that we thought were the ones were the automatic open door for success, those, if they were so highly valued, but just coming out of the banking industry, you have people that do origination, and that needs human skills. But when you're sitting down underwriting, i.e. looking at, will this company, does it have the right margins? Will it have a market? What are the barriers to entry? What do the competitors look like? All the things that you need to look like. Because remember, banks are in the risk-adjusted reward. They're trying to determine all those different things, the modeling of all of that, and then sitting there in the risk committee. I would argue some of those things, would probably be done very, very well by LLMs. But, the origination piece is human to human. And then also needing humans at the end to do the check, to do the relationship management. So I think human skills, communication skills in reading, writing, speaking are going to be absolutely the one thing that a computer and a large language model can't do.
And make the decisions, right?
Yeah.
You-
Somebody has to do the thumbs up. Exactly. Somebody has to say go or don't go.
And I love the part. I spoke to a large group of our folks that run some of our largest accounts, and I said exactly that. I said, if you've never done media training, this is the time to do it. Like you need to be able to articulate your view and your vision, and get comfortable with some of that. Those are not the skills we would normally have taught them, right? Because they're so focused on their competency domain. I think you said it really well, Michael. It's conveying that message and bringing others along.
Let's go back maybe a little bit. Only 2 years ago, right? 2024. Today we're talking about AI. I think it's clearly the hottest topic. In 2024, everything was around the promise of sustainable business and ESG. Currently, I think we don't talk about it in the same way anymore. We talk about corporate resilience. We talk about future proofing for various reasons, right? There's politics. Do you think that leaders today are still being pushed in the same way as they were just a few years ago?
I think the political context clearly is different depending on what country you're based in and what country your business is focused on. People might not say the word sustainability every single day, Marjella, but I actually don't feel with the the companies that I talk to, that it has fallen as far off the radar as maybe the public opinion might seem to think. I just think it's been much more embedded in the business narrative. It is embedded into the transformation. And as I said at the start, I think all these trends are so interconnected that I think the story therefore is slightly different, right? Because you have to grapple with technology. It's bigger than AI. I mean, that's my other worry. People all fall in love with AI. They forget about all the other technologies that are not to be, uh, if you don't get ready for quantum today, you're going to miss the boat again. So that aside, you have the technology agenda, you have the political agenda, you have the sustainability agenda, you have the demographics and the way the world's changing. They're all completely interconnected, right? And therefore, all of the companies that I see, they have it much more embedded in their purpose. And I think finally they see it as a means to survive. They see it as a means to also uh, improve their revenue and the ROI on their margins. So I think it's moved beyond a separate pillar and it's fully embedded into those companies that are looking to survive.
Certainly the narrative and the language has changed. And I agree with Hanne Jesca that basically the word sustainability is great. What do you want to be? Unsustainable in any sense of your business? So that's, so I think that's a very important word. Sustainable means you've got good products, you have good margins, you have all the things that you would look at, defensibility of your. So I think from that point of view, what's interesting, and I think has always been one of the issues around business and climate and broader issues around it. And again, they use a little bit of a kind of a central banker's and an economist phrase, free riding negative externalities, a fancy phraseology for bad stuff. So if you manufacture and sell soda pop and it's all in plastic containers and you don't internalize, so basically those plastic bottles go off and they end up in oceans, they degrade, they become microplastics. And now, because I'm an old guy, roughly I've got the equivalent of a plastic fork in my brain. Seems that there's so much microplastics in our food, in our air and everything, and it goes between the blood organ barrier, and it seems to like our brains more than other organ. But the point being is to internalize that costs money. And the same thing's true if you were a maker of internal combustion automobiles or trucks. Ultimately, there's a variety of free riding negative externalities. There's obviously the emissions, which have everything from carbon that's released, but also NOx particles. And those are not free lunches per se. They manifest themselves in health. So ultimately, I think the transition to a more sustainable, and then the broadest sense of the word, also means ridding or mitigating free riding negative externalities from your business models. But that's a really unpopular thing to do because A, it's very expensive. It's changing your business models. It's bringing down your margin. And in the long term, many of these, it will make you sustainable, but that's assuming you're able to find new innovation and new ways to do it. That's where technology comes in. So obviously you've got electric vehicles are substituting ICE vehicles. They're not perfect yet because they still have lithium ion batteries, the next iteration, but ultimately that's where R&D comes in. That's where tech comes in to be able to start either internalizing or removing some of these free riding negative externalities, but they're huge. I mean, literally carbon emissions which is the largest driver along with methane and other gases, are all generated from the corporations that we finance around the world and work. And if they had to find ways of making their products or doing their services without it, they could, some of them, most of them, but they'd have to be substituted. But that would mean we'd pay a lot more for a bottle of soda. We'd own a lot less stuff. We'd probably create more jobs, but that's an economic revolution. So I think the current political cover is giving some business people a little bit of cover to kind of figure this out and move a little bit slower, because ultimately, if you try to start mitigating certain externalities from your business model, i.e. carbon emissions at a net zero with a 2030, 35, 40 target. Now, mind you, you've got a little sundial where those nonlinear events can happen any given day by this as well. So I've kind of gone off a bit on a tangent, but I guess what I'm saying is the language is different. The risks are the same. The free riding negative externalities are the same, and some are getting mitigated much faster through technology and innovation. Some of them aren't. And I think ultimately from the finance and the debt capital markets point of view, when you start looking at how these companies are changing their business models, will also determine whether or not they get financed. Because even though you don't use the same label, if I can give you 15 gigawatts of wind power, which is basically the untapped wind power around Ireland at a certain price, and then it can be hooked up to interconnectors and sent around Europe at a certain price. It's lower than any brown. That's a pretty compelling one. It also mitigates a large variety of negative externalities, brings in some other ones, but again, you start weighing them. So I think the language has changed, but what businesses need to do, how they get financed, are still around the fundamentals. And for the most part, in core areas, the only thing I lament a little bit is I do think the ESG, it was a bigger thing. It was also how employees treat their employees, the governance, the social bits also is getting kind of wiped out a bit. And I think that's a bit of a shame, because I think there's some really good stuff embedded in that. And I think some of that, some corporations are letting that go, others are not. And leaders being brave enough to stick their head above the parapet, I think will ultimately be rewarded, because they'll be showing leadership both to their markets, to their employees, and to their customers.
And continuing on a little bit on that, I think one of the things we saw around the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is that it had the potential of creating a larger level playing field amongst businesses to get started on the journey of focusing on these new risks and opportunities. Of course, now that mandate is much smaller, I also think the whole appeal of the CSRD has gotten much smaller. So would you say that these companies will still get going with sustainability simply given the real economy is showing them that that has to happen? Or is that more of a role for those larger companies that have these smaller companies in their value chain? So I'm talking about the mid-market segments here.
Yeah, and the mid-market, because again, everyone, and by the way, those create a huge amount of jobs in every country as well. SMBs are kind of like the policymakers, that they're convinced that's going to be where that's the key, and it is an important key, and they do run on tight margins. But if you go to even emerging markets, much less ones that are developed, you can see bottom up changes. So in a lot of African and Asian countries, you've got power cuts, things of that sort. But what's happened is the cost and the efficiency the cost of just gone right through the floor, and the efficiency has gone right through the roof on solar panels. So in Nigeria, South Africa, SMEs, small businesses are getting two solar panels and a small battery. All of a sudden, they've got consistent power for their business and their company, which they didn't. And these are, one of them is a coal generating country, and the other one's a big oil and gas producer. But ultimately, from the bottom up, the people are demanding it. So I think in some ways the quality and the change in this technology will continue to push. As I said, even in the US, 90% of all new energy is still green. And so some of it's going to change. For the smaller ones, it's harder, it's more expensive. I do lament this. I think there's policy ways to help offset this a little bit. Policy is about incentives. Incentives are both carrots and sticks. So you can help SMEs in that transition by offering tax abatements, things that can help SMEs, do that transition better. But I think a lot of our policymakers have abdicated a lot of their leadership. There are some that are showing great leadership still, but for the most part, many aren't.
Yeah, the question always is, and you might be surprised with what I'm going to say, but I'm not sure that regulation is the best measure to get things moving, even though I'm a studied lawyer. But that's the real question. Like there's been so much debate, Marjella, around the CSRD. I think it has to come from within, and it has to come from, you have to find the economic value. And I think a lot of companies are beginning to find that economic value. And clearly with all the gas and now the oil crisis, that's helping a lot of companies to look at the cost element. So I think it's a more natural and sustained way of actually having companies really define this in their long-term strategy, rather than just complying because it is a regulatory piece. We've had other parts of regulatory, and they still haven't achieved what they were going to achieve, are they? And I think with that pace of change, those that really bring those two pieces together are probably the long-term winners around the whole game.
I agree. And I think even when it does come to policy and regulation, it does need to be a combination of carrots and sticks. Even though we're a bit behind the game, we're catching up quickly. But the UK had 2 days of negative energy costs last year. Some of the Nordics and other ones have many more than that. And that's because we had huge winds up in Scotland. The problem we had was basically we didn't have enough large industrial batteries to store it or interconnectors to send it over to Ireland. But the point being is we would not have had that without some policy incentives to kind of prime the pump to get that industry going. And there's still issues around making sure it's affordable. And there's also things that where you also need, as we've talked about, the profitability of industries. But there are sometimes some other elements such as energy security, not wanting, which that sometimes you wrestle with, how do you get both when they're both not, that can't be perfectly squared. So sometimes there are bigger things in there that need to be addressed as well.
I think with that, we are also getting to the end of our podcast for today. I would like to thank Hanne Jesca Bax for being our guest today, as well as Michael Sheren. I really enjoyed the conversation. And as we wrap it up, we also want to thank everybody for listening into the podcast. And for all of the listeners, remember, together we have this collective impact when we all stand together. So with that, thank you all. If you want to stay in the loop on the evolving world of non-financial risk and corporate strategy, from AI and climate to market access and workforce management, join Harbor, our community platform for professionals leading those efforts. Get access to exclusive content, events, and the opportunity to send in questions for future guests of this podcast. Follow Datamaran on LinkedIn or visit our website for more details. Harbor is also available as an app in both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. You'll find all the links in the episode description.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to catch you again on the next episode of Collective Impact.